Welcome back, everyone. So hopefully all of you who are local have received your RISE toolkit, the cool mug, mask, and the Georgian chocolate bar, also known as my breakfast today. Take some pics with that swag and it might make you Instagram famous. You can also head to the lobby and see the cool photo booth. We're going to still have fun today, even though we're safe at home. And I just wanted to thank you all for your participation today. I also wanted to share a special thank you to NSERC and our good friends at Central Ontario Broadcasting. Their team is absolutely fantastic and we're grateful for their support. Dave Carr, John Arruda, and team, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you. We've reached the point in day 2 where we are joined by our highly anticipated keynote speaker, Dr. Jim Stanford. He's an economist, the director of the Center of the Future of Work. Dr. Stanford is one of Canada's best-known economists. He served for over 20 years as economist and director of policy with Unifor, Canada's largest private sector trade union, which was formerly the Canadian Auto Workers. He's also the Harold Innis Industry Professor at Economics at McMaster University and an honorary professor in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney, Australia. He received his PhD in economics at the New School of Research in New York. He also holds an MPhil in economics from Cambridge University and a BA in economics from the University of Calgary. We have an academic all-star here. Even reading that out, I was feeling so impressed. Dr. Stanford is the author of Economics for Everyone, a short guide to the economics of capitalism. Jim has also provided research and advice through numerous federal and provincial government panels and inquiries on economic policy, innovation, jobs, and social policy. Dr. Stanford will be talking to us today about the recession caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has impacted different groups in unique ways. And most importantly, he will discuss key principles that could alleviate this unfair burden. Please use the chat for questions and comments. We are going to have a great Q&A session at the very end. And at this time, I will turn it over to Dr. Stanford. Dr. Stanford, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that generous introduction. And thank you to Georgian College for, first of all, hosting this wonderful event, Rise Up. It's just an amazing panoply, really, of different activities and presentations and panels and learning, and doing it under such challenging circumstances. So good on Georgian College for making that happen. I'm really glad to join you. I'm going to talk about these challenging circumstances that we face and how they've impacted the world of work. I'll talk about the unequal pandemic. I'll go for about 40 minutes or so with the presentation, and that will leave some good chance for Q&A and discussion at the end of it. Now, I should give your audience a bit of a heads up. I am an economist, as was mentioned. And that means I'm into a little bit of the charts and graphs and statistics and so on. We'll try to keep it as accessible and entertaining as possible. They do say, after all, that an economist is someone who's good with numbers, but didn't have the personality to become an accountant. Okay, so I'll just kind of give you that heads up warning there. And if anyone needs to refresh their coffee halfway through the charts and graphs, I won't mind at all. So the unequal pandemic, why COVID's effects on work were so unfair and how to repair the damage. So we'll be talking about what's happened, what's happening, and what needs to happen going forward in order to improve the labor market and make sure that everyone in Canada who wants to work has a chance to work in a decent, safe job. There's our website for the Centre for Future Work at the bottom, centreforfuturework.ca. We publish all of our work open access there, including some work that we've done on COVID and the impacts in the labor market. Also, my Twitter handle and the Centre's Twitter handle are there. You're welcome to tweet from this presentation today. First of all, let's talk about COVID and work and what happened in this incredible year that we've been through. And unfortunately, of course, we're not done yet. Are we? I know that in Ontario, where most of the audience is, we're heading for some more restrictions, and we've got a few tough weeks still ahead of us. Hopefully, in this race that's going on between the variants and the vaccines win, and by summer we're coming out the other end of it. It's been a long haul for everyone, but the burden of the pandemic has been very unequally shared, and this, I think, is a really important thing to keep in mind as we're thinking about how to recover and rebuild once the pandemic is over. Of course, we have never seen anything like this. This is the fastest, deepest decline in Canada's economy and labor market since the 1930s. So we're going back almost a century before we've had a downturn this severe, and this one happened much faster than the 1930s. In the 30s, it took us 2 to 3 years before we really hit bottom. In this case, we hit bottom in weeks. once the pandemic started. We had a situation where entire sections of the economy had to be shut down in order to stop contagion, starting back last March, so over a year ago now. The sort of consumer-facing, hands-on industries like retail, hospitality, entertainment and arts, personal services, a lot of transportation, those are the things that had to be shut down to stop contagion. And of course, as we see right now, they're being shut down again in varying degrees to stop contagion, including of the new variants. The problem is, in the economy, one thing is connected to another thing, and everything is ultimately connected to each other. So it didn't stop with just those immediate sectors of the economy that had to be closed for health reasons. So if you close a retail shop, for example, think what happens. They're not selling anything. That means they're not placing orders with the wholesaler. The wholesaler isn't selling anything, so they're not placing orders with the manufacturer, and so on and so forth. So it spreads through the whole economy that way. And the disruption in supply chains that resulted, including from limits on international travel and international trade, made it all the worse. Also, we've had other chain reactions happen. Consumer spending really declined for a number of reasons. Many Canadians lost their jobs, and we'll talk about that. Even those that didn't lose their jobs didn't have as much chance to go shopping. That was the point of the shutdowns. And of course, we're all very worried about what's happening. So there's a natural tendency to kind of sit on your wallet and put off major purchases, which, because we worry about what's in the future. The problem is, if enough people stop making major purchases, then the economy does indeed go into a bit of a tailspin. Similarly with business investment and exports. So what started out with a what you would call a supply shock, a supply shutdown in certain areas of the economy, has now morphed and expanded into an overall demand side recession, where even if the health restrictions were lifted tomorrow, and they won't be, but even if they were and everyone took the vaccine and the vaccine worked, you wouldn't snap back to where you were. We have a situation where confidence and purchasing power and spending are all much lower than they should be. I expect it will take us years to rebuild the quantity of work back to where it should be. And I also argue, as you'll see, that we need to be fixing the quality of work as well, to make sure that jobs are safer and more reliable as we go forward. In terms of the numbers, we lost 3 million jobs in Canada between February and April last year. 3 million jobs. That was about a 15% decline in total employment. And in fact, that didn't tell the whole story, because there were a lot of people who were still technically employed but not working. They were on the payroll, if you like. They were on the workers on their employer's system, but they weren't working any hours because of the shutdowns. By November, we had won back 80% of what we lost, which was good, obviously, but that still left us about 750,000 jobs below where we should have been, which on its own would still be a very severe recession in the labor market. And then that's when the second wave hit, and now we're in the third wave. So the employment numbers are still very much in jeopardy. Same goes for the total amount of goods and services produced in the economy, what we call GDP, which declined 18% in those 2 months. Again, we've never seen anything that deep, that fast. Lots of problems faced by households that lost income, businesses that lost income, different organizations, even universities and colleges figuring out how to manage their budgets given the decline in enrollments that many have experienced, and so on. So this is, again, a very serious challenge for our economy and our labor market. And the key task is to make sure we don't get stuck in a downturn that's a lot like a depression. I mentioned this is the steepest downturn since the 1930s, and we don't want this to become the 1930s, where it took a decade of depression followed by a world war in order to get the economy re-engaged again. And so this is the challenge, to obviously help people through the pandemic, but also prepare for an economic recovery at the end of it. So there is the picture, if you like, in terms of the employment over the last year and a bit. We lost those 3 million jobs just in 2 months. Then we started bouncing back by late fall. It seemed that we were doing much better, but with the second wave and now the third wave, employment has been flat or falling again. So we still have a challenge to be creating new jobs once it's safe to go back to work. One thing I want to stress is that, some have argued that there was a trade-off between protecting public health and protecting the economy. The argument being that, well, COVID is bad, but we can't shut everything down. It will hurt the economy too much. And that argument really has not panned out at all. And in fact, if you look around the world, the countries that did the best at stopping the contagion are the countries whose economies have bounced back the strongest. And that really shouldn't be a surprise. The problem that we face here is not the shutdowns per se. The economic problem we face is the pandemic. And the best way to protect the economy is indeed to protect the human beings who make up the economy. That's what the economy is. It's all of us who go about our work, producing, doing our jobs, generating income and spending that income. And if we aren't healthy, the economy isn't going to be healthy as well. And in retrospect, we should have been faster and more determined and more focused in doing whatever was required to stop contagion, rather than imagining that we could somehow just get to a certain level of contagion that would be acceptable and then open up the economy again. The countries in the world that did much better, this would include places like Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Taiwan, some European countries like Norway, are the countries that put in the strictest restrictions and put them in fast and strong. And then you've got places like New Zealand today, which is pretty well opened up. They're virtually COVID-free, and they can go about their business. They can go to concerts, they can go to clubs, they can eat at restaurants, and all of the things that we're still dreaming of, precisely because they acted forcefully to protect public health. And the argument that you hear from some business lobbyists that you shouldn't shut down restaurants, we're hearing it today in Ontario, very, very self-centered and self-defeating. Ultimately, those restaurants will not be served by, halfway measures that allow the pandemic to keep raging. We can see this interprovincially in Canada. If you compare the caseloads that have been experienced versus the decline in employment, it's not a perfect match, but in general, the provinces that had the smallest number of cases, and in Canada's case, that's the Atlantic area, the Atlantic provinces, in general, experienced the most modest job losses. On the other hand, places that tried to go easy, that had a so-called balanced approach, Alberta stands out in that regard, have had very high contagion and the biggest job losses. So it's not a trade-off at all. The economy and health go hand in hand, and the best way to get our economy going again is going to be to defeat this pandemic. They say that misery loves company, and boy, have we got company in this downturn. This graph, I know it's an eyeful here, shows the change in GDP last year in 2020, change in total economic output for all of the major industrial countries. And you'll see Canada there right smack in the middle, about a 5.5% decline in our total output. Again, we've never experienced that in 1 year before, almost matching the OECD average. And some countries did better, some countries did worse. In general, the countries that did better are countries that restricted the spread of the contagion most effectively and aggressively. And you see at the very top there, there's one country that actually their economy grew last year, and that's where the pandemic started, ironically, in China. But they responded very firmly and effectively, limited contagion, and then they were able to open up more of their economy much faster. So Canada's been kind of in the middle. We all like to, be proud of the fact that we've done so much better than the United States in limiting contagion, and we should be, but we certainly didn't do as good of a job as we could have, as witnessed by some of the other countries that are out there. Now, I want to talk about what this means in terms of unemployment with the job losses. The official unemployment rate was 8.6% in December. It's down a little bit from that for March. February actually is the most recent data that we've got, 8.2%. But that doesn't tell the whole story. That's kind of the tip of the iceberg, if you like, in this regard. In order to count as officially unemployed in Canada's labor market statistics, you have to be not working at all, even 1 hour. If you had a job, at a store or a restaurant, you worked one little shift in the week, then you're counted as employed, even though you're working hardly at all. So you can't have worked a single hour. You can't be still on the employer's payroll system. that is waiting for hours or shifts to get scheduled in the future. And you have to be actively seeking work. That means putting in several applications a week. Because if you're not actively seeking work, then you're not considered unemployed. You're considered to be outside of the labor force. It's a very artificial way to measure the statistics. Well, who's going to be putting in several applications a week right now? The public health officials are telling us all to stay home. So, you know, that's a bit of a crazy definition. If we count people who are employed but didn't work at all because they're waiting for shifts, who aren't actively seeking work, or who've lost most of their hours, then realistically, you're looking at an unemployment rate in Canada today of around 15%. That's a better judgment of what the true unemployment situation is and why we have so much ground to recover. Now, there's been a debate among economists about what the recovery is going to look like and how it's going to occur and how long it's going to take. And it's kind of boiled down to a debate over letters of the alphabet, which I find kind of interesting. Economists love to get all of their big mathematical models and spreadsheets and everything in, and lo and behold, we're having a debate about letters of the alphabet. The V-shaped recovery are those who see a quick snapback as soon as it's safe to go back to work. Others call it a U-shaped recovery. They expect a bit of time in a downturn, but eventually we will snap back to where we were. The L-shaped recovery are the pessimists in the crowd who don't see a recovery at all necessarily. One interesting theory is the K-shaped recovery, which is different groups or different segments of the economy are on different paths. Some parts of the economy will recover quickly, other parts of the economy won't, and they might actually continue declining. There's a grain of truth in that argument, but I don't think it quite sums up the challenge. My vision of the recovery is something like this. This is an interesting shape. It's not a letter in the alphabet, not in the English alphabet anyway, where we've had that initial shutdown that was steep and fast, partial rebound, but not getting back all the way. And we saw that happen. We had won back 80% of the lost jobs by November, but then bouncing along the bottom, if you like, because we're going to get different outbreaks, different waves of contagion. And even without that, we have a situation where consumers and businesses are not spending like they should be spending. And that is going to keep us in a partial recovery, a state of partial recovery, but still with lots of unemployment and dislocation, a partial recovery that's still on its own a very deep recession. Unless we have, and this is one of my key points, a very sustained and ambitious reconstruction effort that will have to be led by government in Canada to get the ball rolling and get us back to where we need to be in terms of the full potential of the economy. So the question is, what do you call this? You know, it's not a letter of the alphabet. If you turn your head sideways, it looks a bit like a corkscrew, maybe a corkscrew on its side with a kind of, you know, trendy modern handle to the corkscrew. I don't know about that. Somebody on social media suggested it looked a lot like the Loch Ness monster. Look at this. Okay, you see there's the Loch Ness monster, and you see its neck going in and then coming back out and bouncing along the bottom, which looks kind of similar to that picture that I drew. So I have patented the term Loch Ness monster recovery, and I expect to win the Nobel Prize for it someday. But the key point here is that we aren't going to get back to a full recovery without a dramatic and sustained plan to get there. And I'll talk a bit about that later in the presentation. Now, I have argued that we have to change work for good. I argue that it's going to take years to rebuild the quantity of work, but we have to be also focusing on rebuilding the quality of work if we want to reopen the economy and stay open safely and sustainably. So we did some work through our center, 10 ways that the COVID pandemic means we must change work for good. And for good means both senses of the word. It means for better, obviously, but it also means permanently. We have to learn from the problems that we faced during the pandemic to improve our labor market in ways that make it a better, safer, more inclusive and fairer labor market going forward. We did see ways in which we didn't enter the pandemic in the best of shape. We have some problems and some inequalities and some fractures, if you like, in our labor market that we were aware of for years. but weren't adequately addressing in terms of some of the inequalities that's experienced, in terms of people who are excluded from good jobs in the labor market, in terms of the way that the nature of jobs was changing. And fixing those problems, I argue, improving the quality of work will be necessary to reconstruct the economy going forward. So our report listed 10 different ways that work must change for good if we're going to have a more successful economy and a safer, more stable, more fair labor market coming out of the pandemic. I don't have time to go through all 10 of them today. Maybe I'll give you a little taster flight, if you like. For those of you who've been to the bar or the pub, and they've got this gimmick where they bring you out 4 glasses of beer, right? 4 different flavors of beer, and they cute little glasses on the little tray of flight. So I'll give you a flight, a taster flight of some of the ways that work must change for good. I'll look at this issue of space at work. I'll look at the issue of working from home. I'll talk about the problem of precarious work and how that has made the pandemic much, much worse. And talk about how do workers have a say, have a voice in their workplaces as a way of making jobs safer in the future. So those are the 4 little glasses on your taster flight there. First one, giving people space. Workplaces have been a very important source of workplace contagion. People who are working in face-to-face jobs, even as the pandemic went on, were the ones most likely to come down with the pandemic, with COVID. And often they got blamed for it. I know there's been this underlying tendency to say it's all young people's fault because they're going out and partying without masks on. There is some of that, of course, but how about the fact that young people are the ones doing all that face-to-face work by and large at retail shops and restaurants that were still open, and other so-called essential jobs that kept going. And the thing that really determines how much at risk you are of catching COVID on your job is how close you work to other people, whether it's customers or clients or your colleagues. And the danger was highest in workplaces where people were shoulder to shoulder. You know, think about a busy Tim Hortons franchise where you could have 8 people going around serving coffee, grabbing food, you know, bumping into each other. Those are the sorts of things. Meatpacking plants has been a very dangerous site. Care facilities like long-term care where you're working close to your clients and other workers. So if we're going to fix this going forward, we've got to give people a little bit more space on the job, and that is going to be good for their health. It's also going to be good for their dignity. It isn't very pleasant to have to spend 7 or 8 hours right shoulder to shoulder with someone else. The boss never does that. The CEO always has a great big spacious corner office with a door that closes. And obviously not everyone can have that, but the natural tendency of employers to conserve and reduce and minimize the amount of space that's given people on their job has to be restrained and reversed so that people have more space at work. We did an analysis that showed a correlation between how much space you have at work and how little or how much you make in your job, and they tend to go together. People who have more space at work are also, because they've got more influence, more power, more bargaining power, also people who make more money, whereas people who work very closely to others, like in food manufacturing or waiters or cashiers, are the ones who make the least money. So the reality is giving people more space at work will be healthier. It'll also be fairer because we're going to be helping people who have otherwise relatively lower and insecure incomes anyways. The second of those little tasters on our flight of beers here, making homework fair. We've seen a huge increase in working from home during the pandemic. I don't think it will stay at that elevated level permanently, but some of it will. I think we'll end up with a situation where more people are working from home even when the pandemic is over. And there are some benefits from that. It has allowed people to keep working and keep earning income despite the pandemic without risk of going to work and riding the bus and catching COVID. On the other hand, there's some challenges around working from home that we have to be on top of as we go forward. The number of Canadians working from home tripled in those first months of the pandemic between February and April to over 5 million Canadians. It declined a bit during the summer and fall as the contagion slowed down, but it bounced back up again later in the year. So we've still got 5 million Canadians, or well over a quarter of all people working from home. And it will not stay at that level once it's safe to go back to work, but it will stay higher. And there's lots of issues that we've got to be thinking about in terms of working from home as an ongoing challenge in the labor market. You've obviously got to have a proper setup. You can't just be sitting on your couch doing your work all the time. That's not effective, it's not productive, it's not healthy, it's bad ergonomics. So we've got to have a situation where people working from home are given space and compensation for the extra costs of working from home. We have to make sure they've got proper setups, good ergonomics, good lighting. We've also got to monitor the issue of time. You know, when your job is there beside the couch on your laptop, there's a tendency for your employer to expect that you're always on the job. And that can't be the case, especially for people who are trying to balance paid work with their family responsibilities, caring for children, and so on. And of course, women have a very unfair share of that home burden. So lots of issues there. Then if we're going to continue working from home, we've got to make sure it's fair and safe, including provisions on all of those issues. The third glass on our flight of testers there is precarious work. Precarious work means referring to jobs that are not your sort of standard full-time permanent job with benefits. And I suspect that there aren't many Georgian college students who can even hope for a full-time permanent job with benefits, because young people today in Canada have just become immune to the fact that there's, you know, when you go out and work, you're trying to get shifts. You don't know exactly when you're going to work. You probably don't have good benefits, and you might even be working 2 or 3 jobs to put them together just to try and make ends meet. That's what we call precarious work. And we knew this was a problem before the pandemic came along, but the pandemic showed it was a crisis, not just for the people in precarious jobs who have the challenge of balancing various forms of work without enough income and without enough security. It's a challenge for public health, because you've got a situation where precarious workers don't have sick pay, they don't have paid leave, they don't have paid holiday. And they don't have the normal benefits, which means they're pressured economically to continue working, even if they should be at home, because they might have come into contact with someone who had COVID. You also have the problem of multiple job holding, where people in precarious jobs work in multiple sites. Well, during a pandemic, that means you're taking the pandemic around to multiple sites, which is hardly safe. We saw that in the long-term care centers. Which have been a disaster, of course. 80% of the deaths from COVID in Canada were in long-term care centers, and one of the reasons why is because the personal service and care workers, many of them in precarious situations, were often working in multiple sites. So if they got exposed, they actually took the virus to more than one location. So for all those reasons, we have to put some rules and limits on precarious work and give people a chance to have one job, a decent job with enough hours and enough benefits to do it fairly. Just to show you how unequal the burden from the pandemic was and the job losses, we broke down the job losses in those initial months, 15% or 3 million jobs lost in those 2 months. Broke them down between different kinds of positions, and people in precarious jobs just were hammered. They bore the brunt of that initial downturn. People in part-time jobs, 30% of them disappeared in those first 2 months. People in temporary jobs, 30% of them disappeared. So a situation where employers could get rid of you more easily meant that you bore the brunt of it, whereas paid professionals in permanent jobs, they were more likely to keep their jobs and be able to do them at home. In fact, there's millions of well-off Canadians who didn't lose $1 of income from this pandemic. And that's how it really did exacerbate the unfairness. Our labor market was already unfair before the pandemic, and it was much more unfair now. Working in the private sector was much worse than working in the public sector. The public sector was an anchor of stability in relative terms. And if you had a union, you were much less likely to lose your job in those initial months than people without a union, precisely because the union contract then has provisions about notice and severance and seniority that meant more people could keep their jobs. So all of this just proves that people in relatively insecure, low-paid jobs were the ones who were hit first and hit hardest by this pandemic. And if we don't address that as we recover, by focusing the recovery effort on people who need it the most, we'll have ongoing damages and dangers in our social fabric because of that unequal burden. The last of those four tasters, if you like, is the idea that workers have to have a say. And it is kind of a common thread that links all of the other items that we had on our agenda. None of those things that have to change for good in the world of work are gonna be achieved unless workers have a say, have some power, have some influence, and some capacity to negotiate with their employers over it. And that goes from micro issues like health and safety in the workplace to make sure we've got good COVID protocols and so on. It also goes for economy-wide issues like this need to regulate precarious work. And so part of our research at the Center for Future Work is thinking about, what are the different ways that workers can have a say in their workplaces to make sure that jobs are better, safer, and fairer as we come out of the pandemic. Let me take the last few minutes of my presentation and talk about how we rebuild after COVID. We've seen the dramatic impact of COVID on the labor market. We've seen how unfair that burden was shared. Let's talk a little bit about how we're going to recover. Of course, we're not there yet. We're in the third wave of COVID. We've had governments that have been more tentative and in a way confused about how they're responding to the variants and so on. We've had a few shutdowns, and it looks like Ontario is going to go for a harder shutdown starting tomorrow. We've got the vaccines coming, and good news, the vaccines work, but we can't get enough of them fast enough. And even if everyone got the vaccine tomorrow, and of course, we've got the issue of vaccine hesitancy that we have to address and encourage people to take the vaccine. That wouldn't fix the economy because you've still got those problems of reduced spending power, reduced confidence, business investment. You've had employers that have shut down, not because they had to for health reasons, but because they don't have a market. Their customers aren't there. So lots of uncertainty out there, and we cannot expect, this is where the V-shaped optimists are absolutely wrong. We cannot expect the economy just to snap back where it was once the pandemic is over, not least because it's already clear that with the variants and so on, we're going to be facing various levels of contagion for years to come. So we need a stronger, more focused plan to get out of this. And for this reason, I think we need what I've been calling a national reconstruction plan. We have a situation where the private sector, individual consumers and individual businesses are damaged. Their confidence has been shaken. They don't know what's around the corner. They're going to be reluctant to put out the big money that's going to be required to get the economy going at full bore. The only part of the economy that has the authority and the access to financial resources and the ability to act on a national scale or a provincial scale is government and the public sector. And they are going to have to lead what I would view as a multi-year reconstruction program with lots of elements. There's lots of things that need to be done, lots of work that needs to be done, where Canadians could be employed and put to good use, helping recover from the pandemic. That includes, obviously, investments in strengthening the health system, including our public health infrastructure, which has been challenged, the long-term care centers, which are a national shame, how they unfolded, really have to be reconstituted as part of our regular healthcare system. Other forms of public infrastructure, whether it's physical infrastructure like transportation and utilities and energy, or whether it's social infrastructure like education and I mentioned healthcare and other human and caring services. Those are places where work can be created and incomes generated. We've got a whole climate transition that's happening and that has been accelerated by the pandemic. We know that fossil fuels will never again lead Canada's economic development. We have to be investing in the new forms of energy and the infrastructure and the products like electric vehicles that go with it. The housing sector is going to be a huge flashpoint. An ironic side effect of the pandemic, because interest rates were cut to basically zero, made it cheaper for some people to go out and buy a house, even though the price of houses has gone out, into space. Very, very rapid housing inflation. People, especially investors and speculators, are buying property, and that's putting the housing out of reach for millions of people. So young people today have a really hard time imagining how they would ever buy a house, particularly given the precarity of the jobs that they're looking at. So we have to have a housing plan that looks at making housing affordable and other strategies. The overall goal of the Reconstruction Plan, we need to improve the quantity of work, the number of jobs, but also the quality of work. Make sure those jobs are better, more stable, more secure, and better paying. There's actually a very good historical analogy for this idea of a national reconstruction plan. Back in World War II, Canada faced another national emergency. We had to join the fight against global fascism. And Canada threw everything it could into that. We made an outsized contribution to the war against fascism, and we not for a moment stopped to say, can we afford it? Is the budget deficit going to be too big? No one ever said that. We knew what we had to do, and we did it. And even years before the war ended, we were already planning for a reconstruction. There was no debate about a V-shaped recovery. Because remember what it was like before the war. We had just finished a 10-year depression. We'd been in depression and stuck there because we didn't have a reconstruction plan. Then along comes the war, and we're suddenly not in depression anymore. In fact, we're at the opposite. We've got every single person working. But we knew we couldn't just go back to where we were before the war because that was unacceptable. So the government at the time started planning for reconstruction 2 years before the war was even over. And this guy, C.D. Howe, was one of our most legendary cabinet ministers, and he helped develop the war effort and the war planning that helped the economy do everything that it could. Then he was put in charge of the post-war reconstruction plan, including all kinds of measures around building industries. Here he is at an aerospace plant. Canada had an outsized aerospace industry, in part because of what we did during the war. But also infrastructure, things like the Trans-Canada Highway and the St. Lawrence Seaway, social programs like the Canada Pension Plan and Medicare that all came about during this post-war era. For years after the war, government was leading a sustained economic expansion that supported private sector activity, but also public sector activity. It supported jobs and incomes, and it also supported what we call the social wage. That is to say, the different social benefits that supplement our standard of living and make us more secure. And so there's lots of things that we can be investing in as we go forward. And this is really important. The federal budget is coming out in a couple of weeks. And we're already hearing lots of, I would say, predictable and unconvincing arguments that the government should be scaling back because of the deficit that it incurred. Quite the contrary. We need to be expanding what we're doing in order to get purchasing power flowing, get jobs created, and confidence up. And as I mentioned, there's a whole portfolio of necessary projects that can and should be funded as part of this reconstruction as we come out of the pandemic. Here's just one example among many. The whole issue of childcare, or what we call early child education. Women suffered more job loss during the downturn than men did for various reasons. Women were more likely to be employed in those hands-on face-to-face services like retail and hospitality. They're also more likely to be employed in precarious jobs, part-time jobs or temporary jobs that were easy to get rid of. Finally, women are also bearing an unfair share of the burden of care and family responsibilities at home, and particularly when schools were closed. That made it impossible for them to keep their jobs. So for all those reasons, this was a recession, really the first recession in our history where women suffered more of the initial job loss than men did. One way to address that gender imbalance in the impacts of the pandemic would be a national early child education program. Basically making childcare like schools. We expect schools in every community. Everyone can go to school, and it's for the most part free if you go to the public system. We need something similar to that for early childhood education. Say for everyone from 1-year-olds, we get parental leave that allows parents to stay home with their kids for the first year of their life. But beyond that, they should have the opportunity to go to high quality early childhood education until they reach school age. If you did that, you'd create 200,000 jobs for people in the early childhood education centers. More jobs in the supply chain, including construction and services and utilities that supply the early childhood education. Then the really big gain is because women are able to put their kids in high quality care, that means they can join the labor market. And the experience in other provinces like Quebec, which has a good childcare system, shows that you get a very big boost in women's labor force participation as a result of early childhood education. And if you put all those things together, you're going to create a great big boost in output and employment and government revenue, not because you raise taxes, but because the economy is bigger and the government's automatically taking in more revenue, which is enough to actually pay for the early childhood education programs itself. So this is literally an example of a social program that pays for itself because it's allowing more people to work, generate income, and pay taxes. This is just one example of a sort of ambitious, expansive approach to Reconstruction that we're going to need as we come out of the pandemic. Now, we're going to hear lots of arguments, of course, as we have about debt and deficits, and government can't afford this, and government should be downsizing. This would be an absolute disaster. Again, this would put us back into depression. That Loch Ness monster recovery that I drew would be stuck in it for years and years and years if we get sidetracked by concerns about the deficit. Yes, the deficit was big during the pandemic, and good thing that it was. That's a sign that government was doing its job. Government was protecting Canadians during a crisis, and government has the capacity to do that. The federal government has virtually unlimited finances. Provincial governments have more constraints, but even they have a lot of flexibility. And the historical analogy again to World War II, when we had debt that was equal to 150% of our GDP, nobody cared. That's literally the case. We participated in that war, and then we won the war, and then when the war was over, we kept spending. That's the point. Governments had deficits in most years after World War II as part of financing that sustained expansion that was vital. What is the ultimate limit on what we can do as we come out of the pandemic is how many Canadians are around willing and able to work. And as I mentioned, we've got 15% effective unemployment in Canada. And until we get that down close to zero, we can absolutely afford to do more, not less. And we need to be creating more work as we go forward. Some of the obsession on government debt and deficits is really unbalanced, because the reality is all parts of our economy have debt and deficits. Households do. In fact, households are way more indebted than government is as a share of our GDP, and getting worse because of that huge surge in housing prices that I mentioned. Corporations go into debt. There's no argument that corporations should pay off debt as their first act. In fact, corporations are supposed to go into debt if they can raise money and invest it and earn more return on the investment than pay an interest rate. That's a profit maximizing thing for businesses to do. So government, in a way, is exactly the same. Government carries less debt than both corporations and households. The federal government cannot go broke. It cannot go bankrupt because we have our own currency and we have a Bank of Canada, so it's impossible for the government to go broke. And we have a great ability to set and monitor interest rates so that we don't have to pay huge interest costs on that debt. So for all those reasons, we have to have perspective. This is one interesting way to look at it. This shows the change in the financial balance of different parts of the economy during the worst part of the pandemic, comparing the end of 2019 to spring 2020, which is when we're at our worst. And the federal government's net balance for that quarter, for that 3-month period, deteriorated by about $100 billion. So you say, does that make us poorer? Well, other sectors of the economy actually ended up better off as a result of it, particularly households. Why? Because the government was spending money on CERB and the wage subsidy and all kinds of other benefits. The CESIB, some Georgian College students might have got that student benefit last summer, and other ways to support Canadians through the worst of the crisis. So the government's deficit literally is our surplus, and individual Canadians in aggregate are richer because the government went into the deficit. And so this argument that we can't do these things because of the deficit is quite wrong. Let me wrap up and thank you all for your patience. We have been through a brutal year, and the pandemic itself was bad enough, but the fact that the impacts of the pandemic were so unfairly distributed made it worse. And we have to address that unfairness, that inequality as we go forward. And there is an opportunity, a silver lining, if you like. We've recognized that people doing essential jobs, including ones we often overlook, like retail clerks and food delivery staff and carers and cleaners, are doing essential labor and should be valued and protected for it. We've understood that government is there to protect us in a crisis, and public services and infrastructure are essential. And I think if we do it right, we can actually end up with a stronger society and a stronger labor market at the end of it. That requires changing some of the assumptions that guided us in the past, that it's a dog-eat-dog world and everyone should be out there on their own. In fact, we're in it together. And even the most badly paid, insecure worker doing personal support work in a long-term care center, we have suddenly realized is a vital task. And our well-being depends on them being healthy and stable and well compensated. So if we go forward and fix both the quantity of work and the quality of work, I think we've got a chance to come back better than we did before. So I will leave it at that, and thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions as we go forward. Sarah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stanford, and thank you for joining us. We do have lots of questions in the chat. We have so much to consider from your talk as we prepare our future grads for the future of work. And also, to highlight again, just for folks on the call that are business owners, to start building in the quality of work into the culture of their businesses. And we do have lots of entrepreneurs here today. I wanted to highlight, speaking to the recession and the gender imbalance, I've heard it being referred to as the she session. And so I am in full agreement with you for the universal childcare. Having 2 kids myself and navigating their care during this various stages of lockdowns, I think it has impacts too on burnout and mental health for women who often take on this responsibility. But I will turn it over to some questions that we have. And folks that are putting the questions in the chat, I'm going to just sort of do these randomly. So please know that I'm not selecting based on any quality of question. Should we be using the early recovery to invest in greening the economy, or should government investment only focus on producing the highest job yields right now? And that question, thank you to Dr. Scott Starring.
Oh, that's a great question. I think absolutely the energy and climate transition is going to be a big part of the recovery. And some parts of that actually do have a very high job quotient. If you like, you get a lot of bang for the buck. You actually certainly get more bang for the buck supporting some of the renewable energy developments and especially energy conservation initiatives, things like retrofitting buildings in order to reduce how much energy you're using. That's a very labor-intensive undertaking, which means you're getting a lot of jobs for it. In any event, we just have to do it. We did learn during the pandemic and the shock to energy markets that fossil fuels are on the way out historically. Renewable energy is not just cleaner, but it's also cheaper now. And will actually position our economy in a better way by fostering investment in renewable energy and industries that use renewable energy as we go forward. In Ontario's case, huge opportunity with the transition to electric vehicles. Ontario's got a very strong automotive sector, very innovative, very high skill, and I think very well positioned. And we've seen some big announcements from auto companies about producing electric vehicles in Ontario. Very encouraging, and I think that's a sign of how the renewable investments can be a really important part of that reconstruction plan.
That's excellent. Thank you for that question as well. I know there is concern that wage subsidies are being spent outside of the province or the community, which doesn't really help in the end. Is there anything governments can do to see the spending stay in our country?
The wage subsidy, of course, was a federal program, and it was delivering money to employers whose revenue had fallen by a significant amount during the pandemic in order to encourage them to keep workers on the payroll. And it, along with the personal income support programs like the CERB, which has been phased out now, but now we have expanded benefits through the employment insurance system and other benefits. that was a way to keep basically to keep the money flowing during the recession. So it was a very powerful and very fast initiative, and it really helped to limit how bad the recession was. Bad as it was, it would have been much, much worse without those measures. Those are federal programs, so there's no limit on where you can live in Canada in terms of one province to another. Obviously, there's pretty big restrictions on traveling internationally right now. I don't think many people are doing that, in part because there's quarantine measures and so on. So I personally would not be worried about a large amount of that money leaking out of the country. And the evidence is clear that Canadian households, as I showed you in that one graph, have got much stronger cash situations today because of the government's willingness to do those programs.
No, that's great. Thank you for answering that. Are you worried about spending creating risky levels of inflation?
Inflation really is not our problem right now, except in very specific areas like housing prices. We have seen, because of the interest rates and the speculative pressures that have unfolded in the housing sector, we've seen some astronomical increases in the price of real estate. But overall inflation has actually been too low, not too high. In theory, Canada's inflation rate is supposed to be kept around 2%. By the Bank of Canada, and it's been well under that for several quarters in a row. So they're actually hoping that inflation comes back a bit, and that will, within limits, of course, that will be a good thing, not a bad thing. It will be a sign that there's purchasing power in the economy, and it will also help to maintain or reduce the level of debt for households and businesses coming out of the pandemic. When inflation is a bit higher, then it's easier basically to service and ultimately pay off your debts. Some people feel that because the government took such extraordinary measures to increase income supports and so on, that we're poised for a big boom in inflation somewhere down the road. I don't see that happening. And if it does, then we know what to do about it. We know how to control inflation. So I don't think that's what keeps me up at night these days is inflation. Actually, deflation, which is the problem of falling prices, is the bigger risk at the moment.
That's great. So a question came in from Dr. Mira Ray. Are there any other countries who have started what you suggest with a national reconstruction program? And are there learnings for us? So Mira had indicated the US has their $1 trillion plan. Is that in line with what you're thinking?
Of course, we've got the new president in America, Joe Biden, and it's actually a $2 trillion plan. It's a $2 trillion COVID reconstruction thing that certainly has elements of the sorts of things that I'm thinking about. For example, it includes a big emphasis on the renewable energy investments that came up in an earlier question. Also contains a big support for what they call Head Start programs in the US, which is kind of like that early childhood education initiative that I was talking about. It's not full universal childcare, but it's a step in that direction, particularly for poorer neighborhoods in the United States, and other measures. So I think there's elements of it. A country that's had, I think, a very ambitious approach is South Korea. South Korea actually has something they call a national reconstruction plan, and it involves big government, but also private sector investments in the kind of range of things that I was talking about, including renewable energy, physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, and public programs, housing, and others. So I think that there's good examples of that philosophy, if you like, for thinking about reconstruction and putting all the pieces in place that we can look to around the world.
Thank you for that. And we have time for one last question here. Thank you to Jonathan and Ms. Mackenzie. Where do you see the most job creation in the private sector through the recovery?
I mean, to some extent, we're going to see it in the same industries that lost jobs in the first part of the pandemic. You know, some of the things where you had to shut things down for health reasons, like in retail and hospitality. Well, as soon as it is safe, then you are going to see at least a partial rebound in those sectors. There are some private sector industries that are going to suffer to recover. Transportation is a big one. Airlines transportation, I am sad to say, is just not going to come back the way that it was, at least not for several years. And then industries which depend on airlines, like aerospace manufacturing, are also in for several tough years. And we've already seen that with some permanent layoffs at Canadian aerospace firms like Bombardier. At the same time, there are other industries that will grow, maybe not necessarily because of the pandemic itself, although there are some, Zoom and some of the other tech companies that have benefited from work from home have done very well. But in a broader sense, the general technology sector has been the most vibrant on the private side. I think construction will do decently. Particularly if we get some of that infrastructure money flowing. Renewable energy has a large private sector component, so you're going to see lots of opportunities in solar, wind power, energy conservation, and other forms of green energy type of investment. So there are some bright spots out there, along with the obvious challenges that we still face.
That's amazing, and lots to consider there for our students as they enter the workforce after they graduate. Dr. Jim Stanford, thank you so much for joining us today, for all of your insights and expertise. I know these things will be rattling around in my brain for the next little while. And on behalf of Georgian College, I just really appreciate your time today.
Awesome, Sarah. Thank you and your team for having me, and good luck with the rest of the conference.
Okay, thank you so much. Wow, everybody, lots to think about this afternoon, but I wanted to quickly give you an overview of the other fun stuff to come. We talked a little bit about purchasing power, and I just wanted to remind everybody that our 3D click and shop marketplace will be open in about 15 minutes, where you can purchase from local entrepreneurs that are working or have worked at the Henry Bernick Entrepreneurship Center. So as we transition to shopping, and I mean the 3D click and shop area, I need to take this bit of time to send my gratitude and appreciation to our team. Kat and Cecilia, wow. The hard work you're putting in is truly paying off, and I've just loved being backstage with you both. We're cheering from you on the sidelines. What you've accomplished is massive, and I know it's a challenge running virtual events and doing brand new things. And so I salute everyone here that's participating in the audience as well as backstage for all being brave and trying this out. I also want to send a quick thank you out to our team, Jenna, Virginia. Virginia was editing lots and lots of videos, which you'll get to check out. The team that I'm describing are just a superpower team that we all get to lean on and learn and grow with. Thank you again for joining us today. And I look forward to rising up with you again tomorrow. And also shout out to Mira and Dr. Jamie Doran and for their vision on this. Take care, everyone, and I will see you later.